I'm going to present on something that is quite quite different from what Rosie's just talked about, because it focuses on survey design. So it doesn't use novel alternative sources of data. And also it focuses on a different aspect of what statistical invisibility and visibility comes with or implies, which is that sometimes quantitative data and quantitative tools can be tools of resistance when they stop or end statistical invisibility. And sometimes they can work the other way around, which is, for instance, when they create problems in a way that it becomes only relevant to certain categories of population. So that's what I call scrutiny. And I'm going to talk about that now through the object, like through the practice of oversampling in particular. So I work sort of more broadly on intersectionality, migration, and how these work together in quantitative, how they can be quantitatively analyzed. And I don't think I need to define intersectionality. I'm not going to go in detail into that. The question of how to model for intersectionality, how to use intersectional methods with quantitative data has already been studied and discussed by people much better qualified than me. What's useful for this presentation in particular is to know that one, the intersectional inequalities faced by migrant women in particular are part of the conversation about intersectionality since the very early days. It's the main topic of mapping the margins. The second thing is that if you think about it sort of theoretically, there are a lot of compatibilities between the intersectional approach as it was initially framed with a legal approach, with the law, and quantitative data and quantitative methods, because both rely on very set categories, boxes in which people fall, and then the question is whether or not these boxes overlap and who falls between the cracks. So what when Crenshaw talks about points of intersectional failure. So this way of thinking about inequalities as a sort of matrix of domination has a strong implication for sample design, because if for it to work, you need to either consider inequalities in an intra-categorical way. So you take a minority group, for any minority group, but for instance, migrants, and you try to investigate the heterogeneity and the inequalities within, or you take a group such as migrant women and you draw points of comparison in this sort of matrix kind of way, which in both cases, that means you need adequate sample size to be able to go within the minority groups and or to be able to compare across relevant groups. And in fact, very often in quantitative work, the question of sample size is a very strong limitation. And people have discussed modeling strategies, some very advanced and very, very creative, but very often at the end of the day, it comes down to there's just so much we can do with the sample that we have. To talk about this, I build a lot on the sociology of quantification, which is it's a stream of sociology, especially drawing on Alain de Rosière. But it's a big school, so I'm not going to go into like everyone that's relevant in it. But I've done sort of like this little graph to show like the different steps and where sample design sort of fits in. Obviously, if you're using something like census data, sample design is not as relevant, or it's not relevant because in theory you're not sampling. But if you're using survey data, and sample design is very important. And especially if you want to work on minority group, then the question of sample design is even more important, because quite often you're going to rely on oversampling procedures so that you do have the data in large enough numbers that you can study people. I'm going to I talk in this presentation mostly about I take the example of understanding society, and especially I discuss the design of the ethnic minority boost sample. I've also worked on the French survey, trajectories and origins. I'll draw some parallels, but mostly I'll be focused on understanding society. So this is a very basic image of what we think of when we think of survey sampling in a sort of classic randomized survey sampling. So you think of it as this is society, and you sort of take at random a sample of people, and from the part of the iceberg that is now over the surface, you can talk about the part that is also under the surface. And what you do with oversampling, and with a lot of surveys really, but with oversampling is you specifically identify a minority group that you think is understudied, that if you were to just draw a randomized sample, you would never have a sample large enough that these people could be analyzed in isolation, analyzed as an independent group. And so you decide, now we're going to have a target sample typically of these people so that they can be analyzed as a separate group. So you bring them actively into the survey focus, right? Now, the first thing to consider in that sort of practice is that there are geographies of oversampling. Oversampling is technically very challenging. Obviously, it means that you need to identify categories that you want to oversample, which is already, but I'll discuss that later. But the other thing is, how do you find these people? Because you're only sampling, this is not the census, you're not going to everybody. So you have to think about how you're going to find those people. And so typically when you're working, if you're trying to oversample migrants or ethnic minorities, that means that most of the time, you're going to focus on areas identified as high concentration of ethnic minorities or high concentrations of migrants. And then you're going to go into these populations, and then you're going to do specific surveying of the population living in these areas so that you can meet the target sample for these categories, right? Obviously, these geographies are not neutral, because the populations who live in high concentration ethnic minority or migrant areas are not just any migrants or any ethnic minorities. People who intermarry tend to leave these areas much more often. People who have steep upward social trajectories also tend to leave. So you're essentially selecting the populations that are most likely to be very involved with their ethnic or migrant communities, or people who have arrived more recently. The other aspect that is perhaps more obvious is, who do you decide to oversample? You have to draw a line on oversampling, and in a way it's a stronger line than the lines you draw when you decide how many categories are we going to have in the ethnic minority question, for instance. Obviously, that is also very political, and it is very visible and very discussed, but it's a different step in a way, and it's a different, you're not going to take all of these categories and you're not going to oversample all of them. So for instance, in Understanding Society, Wave 1 in 2009, the ethnic minority boost sample focuses on 5 target groups. They're the ones I have listed there. And these are the 5 groups that have sample targets that have to be met. And then just to give a parallel, in France, in trajectories and origins, again, you've 5 target groups, and I have listed them there. it's, I'm going to add another level of complexity, but then it's almost done. These are the target groups, and you have sample targets for them. But then you can also have a secondary form of oversampling, which is the people that you're going to retain, but that you're not going to have sample targets with, sample targets for. So typically, with the ethnic minority boost sample, when interviewers were sent out to recruit ethnic minority respondents for the boost sample, they were told, if you encounter any of the, if people tick any of those other ethnic boxes or national boxes, when you screen them at the front door, then they will also be part of the ethnic minority boost sample. They don't come into counting they're not part of the target group, so they'll be extra, but they will still be indirectly oversampled like that. And this group is identified as the second tier sampling group in the sort of sampling procedure. I hope you're still with me. And to look at these, it sounds technical, but to look at this is really to sort of understand what it is, who is it exactly that we're trying to oversample. And there are different layers like that, right? And the sort of the more you go and the more lines are drawn. So at the last layer, when you decide who is not going to be included at all in the ethnic minority boost sample, then you find that none of the white groups are included. These are groups, some of these groups are considered ethnic minority in the census, but they're not considered ethnic minority in the ethnic minority boost. And conversely, you have groups who are not ethnic minorities in the British classifications. They're like, for instance, in this table, you see Middle Eastern, Iranian, or Turkish people. These are not ethnicities as defined in the census. They're in between nationalities and others. And the reason that they're there is because the studies of how people respond to the ethnic minority questions has shown that a lot of Iranian, for instance, and Turkish people say that identify as white when they're asked the question. And in this sampling procedure, the survey designers want to recruit them and don't want them, they consider that these are misidentification. And so they give a more precise categories to make sure that they will be put into the ethnic minority boost sample. And this is these sort of technical conversations about oversampling and layers of oversampling are actually can be quite conflictual in the survey design team, even though they're rarely discussed as it's sort of like outside the survey teams. And that's also when you they also reflect sort of paradigm clashes in the quantitative analysis of population diversity and migration between, like as this interviewer described, between like sort of ethnicity researchers and a more sort of like less pluralist understanding of population diversity, which mostly opposes white to non-white. And this matters for migration researchers because the ethnic minority boost sample in Understanding Society is initially the only part of the survey that asks any question about migration experience and migration journey. And through all of this oversampling process, at the end, you end up with this structure of data. So the plot I've put there is it sort of visualizes the sample in Understanding Society of individuals who take any of the following categories. So either minority ethnic, non-white, born abroad, second generation migrant, and foreign citizen. If they tick any of those boxes, then they're in that plot. And what you see is that the part in red is the ethnic minority boost sample, so that's the oversampling, and that is all completely focused on the first three categories, which are different sort of profile of non-white non-white migrants or non-white descendants of migrants. Now, the fact that a survey would focus in its oversampling strategy on non-white minorities, it is not a bad thing in general. Like, there are perfectly good reasons to do that. And especially if, as in the case in the UK, and there are parallels in France, what survey designers are particularly interested in is researching racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination. That also combines with a sort of focus, especially in the French case, but in the UK too, a sort of governmental and official push for having data on integration measures. And it's generally considered in these approaches that the people who may have integration challenges are not white migrants. But the consequences of all this is that the survey sample design focuses a lot on certain groups of migrants that are also racialized. And that has consequences for intersectional research. Obviously, at a sort of like theoretical level, it feeds into, or it can feed into narratives of migration that sort of always consider that an immigrant is also someone who's racially, culturally different to like imagined national communities that, you know, are supposed to be white and culturally homogeneous. But it also means sort of concretely like that if you don't have samples of white migrant groups, both EU and non-EU, then you're kind of missing a key point of comparison for intersectional research. You kind of need this group as a condition, as a sort of necessary condition and a counterfactual, if nothing else, to talk about specifically the role of immigration regimes, of bordering practices, as not necessarily the same thing as racial discrimination and cultural difference. So I hope that was clear. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.